Xi Jinping visited Moscow earlier this year, he, in front of the cameras, turned to Vladimir Putin and said that the world is seeing changes it has not seen for 100 years, and we are leading those changes, I guess referring to a shift from America, Anglo-America. I'm not entirely sure what he had in mind, but presumably changes in the big international systems of the world. Do you think that's true, that we're seeing bigger changes now than we have for 100 years? Because the last 100
Well,
years have seen a couple of world wars and a couple of revolutions.
God knows,
Many, many
what Mr.
things.
Putin. Every political commentator in the world is being very lavishly rewarded in order to try to read that guy's mind, and you look into it, and it just seems to be a sort of quaking bog. So I'm not sure that I'm going to second guess Mr. Putin, but what I think he had in mind was he was thinking of the Russian Revolution, and what he really meant was that in the last 100 years, Russia hasn't exercised the influence in the world that she exercised at the moment of the Russian Revolution, which did have sort of convulsive seismic ripple effects over much of the world. Was a tremendous encouragement to revolutionaries everywhere. And direct, had sort of direct domino effect. There were a lot of comparable revolutions in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution in Europe, although they were all at that stage pretty much repressed. And if you look back to that period, there were a lot of people looking around the world. Spengler, read this great work, The Decline of the West, which he, in many ways, was a representative. He saw what was happening in Russia as the model for the future. Indeed, Lenin, explicitly advocated it as the model for the future of the world. And a lot of people thought that was probably true, probably valid. It didn't happen, and gradually uh, the recommendability of the Russian model seemed to erode. People sort of found out what was happening under Stalinism. They became a little bit less keen to follow the Russian model or accept this Russian influence. And I think Mr. Putin has always rather regretted that. He's always thought that Russia ought to be the model for the world, as the nationalists often do about their own countries. And so when he says we're going back to something which hasn't happened for 100 years, I think he's hoping for a restoration of Russian power and influence in the world. I suppose it's probably not going to happen. And the future lies, it seems, much more with China, and perhaps the geopolitics are going to be changed in the future also very much by India and Brazil. To a very great extent, whether I think the likelihood of restoration of major Russian influence in the world is probably very small. The big question is whether the abiding influence of the United States is going to survive the rise of China and India. And I think to a great degree that will depend on how realistic my fellow residents of the United States are in making the necessary adjustments. They've become terribly used over the last 100 years to looking down on everybody. And just sort of accepting this sort of almost God-given manifest destiny of being the major influence on the rest of the world. But these periods of hegemony don't typically last for very long, and clearly that of the United States is coming to, if it hasn't already come to an end. And Americans need to adjust to that, and they need to have a more collaborative attitude to other countries, and especially to to their own neighbours. Reason why America became the sort of world's great superpower is that in the period of the rise of the United States to that status in the 19th and very early 20th centuries, they had this enormous country with an enormous amount of resources to exploit. That's no longer the case. They pretty much come to the end of what they can do with their own resources, and in the hemisphere, all the sort of new resources are in the sands of Canada and the under the ice of the Arctic, and Chilean and Argentinian, Antarctic, and Amazonia. So Americans, if they want to continue to be the world hegemon, I think have got to adjust. They've got to do it in collaboration with other countries, especially countries in their own hemisphere. And they also, I think, got to face the fact that they can't be the unique superpower any longer. They've got to treat China with prudence and an attitude of negotiation amongst equals.
And I guess that
I'm saying that with regret, because we don't like the Chinese regime.
Yes.
But you've got to be realistic. And I think one of the big mistakes, for
indeed,
example, that Western democracies made in the 1930s was to alienate Germany and Japan simultaneously. And I think it's an equal mistake at the moment to be alienating Russia and China simultaneously. I don't like the Chinese regime, but I think we do need to be more accommodating if we don't want to drive Putin and Xi into the sort of alliance that Germany and Japan inflicted on the rest of the world.
Mm. And it's a very salient debate in Australia at the moment too, because, well, I mean, America's our security partner, China's our principal economic partner or economic relationship, and the idea of a war in the South China Sea is not anyone's wish, really. But or at least there are a few Americans who perhaps do wish it, I fear.
Well, I definitely think, in Australia you are in a position to, look realistically at this relationship between America and China and give both sides good advice. Because one of the things that worries me living in the United States is that people seem to be incapable of seeing China as anything except an enemy. And obviously that is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people are always saying, well, we've got to have more ships, more missiles, this is seems to me the way to proceed would be to try and find some accommodation, which you wouldn't need continually, to be upping the ante and increasing the risks of a war starting by accident or misunderstanding. But you start from the position that there are so few common interests, it's not worth trying to negotiate, trying to sort of divvy up what's at stake. If you start from that position, I think that you can only exacerbate the enmity. And I'm afraid that's what's happening at the moment. Relations between China and the United States are deteriorating just at the time when what the world needs is them to be improving.
True, very true. I remember once one of my YouTube viewers asked me, is there a way to encourage America to be more comfortable in a, like a multipolar world, which I guess is a shorthand people use for that sort of more equanimity of relationship between people. And my best response to this viewer was to say, well, they should read Felipe Fernández-Armesto's book on the history of America, and how it's not the usual Anglo-American story. It's a more complex warp and weft of many cultures. What's your perspective on the Hispanic history of America?
Yes, well, I was trumpeting my objectivity because this is a case where it's more sort of subjectivity of my posture as a Hispanic in the United States that does make me see the history of the country somewhat differently from some of my WASP Anglo-Saxon
Yes.
Protestant friends. Um, um, yes, the standard account, and it's still, unfortunately, this is still the standard account that most American children get at school, is that the United States is the product of a movement of people and ideas across the continent from east to west. And that these ideas fundamentally came from Britain and from a Protestant intellectual tradition, which is usually, if you've got a sufficiently intellectual teacher, he or she will tell you it's the ideas of John Locke were the starting point of, or the ideas of John Locke distilled from the 17th century English debate about civil liberties and English civil wars of the 17th century. Those ideas are the bedrock of the equipment, mental equipment, intellectual equipment the founding fathers worked with that created the United States. And the result is everybody else has contributed to the United States, including Native Americans and blacks and Jews and Italians and Poles and Germans and all the other 19th century immigrants, without whom, without those people, America wouldn't be what she is. It should be a different country. So all of those stories tend to get underrepresented. But the most underrepresented of all is the Hispanic story of the United States, because Spanish was spoken in the territory of the United States for much longer than English. Spanish political and economic ideas, above all religious ideas, were introduced into the territory of what is now the United States long before there were any English settlers. And to some extent, our picture of a country built from east to west, although it's perfectly valid in itself, is incomplete. And as you also see, the country was built by another process of colonization from south to north. And of course, Americans also fail to acknowledge typically that the Spanish contribution to American independence was absolutely vital. There were more Spaniards fighting for American independence from 1779 onwards than from people from the 13 colonies. And the materiel and the money, mainly came from Spain. And France, of course, contributed. Everybody knows France contributed a lot, but the Spanish contribution was actually much bigger than the French one. So, however you measure it. So in all of these respects, and the way the country was forged by this convergence of movements from east to west and movements from south to north, and in terms of the influence of Spanish culture, and in terms of the direct Spanish contribution to the making of the United States independence and the Revolutionary War, the Hispanic part of the story is really crucial. You can't begin to understand America if you don't take it into account. So in my book on American history, I kind of left out everything else on the grounds people knew about that and focused on the Hispanic story. To some extent, the Hispanic story is, of course, also an indigenous and a black story, so those perspectives do come into it. But my intention was simply to restore a part of the picture that's usually omitted. And to some extent, I suppose it was quite a successful book because it did attract a lot of comment, and it does seem to have influenced some teaching of U.S. history. A lot of students do seem to read it, or to at least have been given extracts from it by their professors. And it does show that you you can get people to rethink their past, but it's very difficult to do it other than by way of add-ons. Fundamental rethinking of history is very hard to achieve, and it's usually achievable only under conditions of terrible political oppression. So, if you censor out all the different perspectives and impose a single one by force, by silencing the opposition, by mandating the compulsory use of tendentious textbooks, all that kind of stuff, that's how you can change people's fundamental understanding of the past. If you're just a sort of scholar in a university in northern Indiana, your power is very limited.